And here we go. Welcome to episode 16 of the See-Through Podcast, a podcast that creates transparency on disabilities and the champions with them. I am your host, Lance Johnson. Today's guest has accomplished quite a bit. She recently published a memoir titled Rare Like Us. She has successfully lobbied the New Jersey legislator and governor to enact a New Jersey law requiring the screening of newborns for adrenoleukodystrophy, or ALD, and she runs an international nonprofit, all at the age of 22. Today's guest is Taylor Kane, the founder and president of Remember the Girls, which is an international nonprofit organization that unites, educates, and empowers female carriers of X-linked genetic disorders, a group that is underrepresented and often overlooked by the medical profession. Taylor's activism began as a preteen, shortly after her father died from the rare X-linked disorder, ALD, or adrenoleukodystrophy. That's also when Taylor learned that she was a carrier of that devastating disease. That new knowledge sparked the many accomplishments Taylor has made and will continue to make as an activist. In fact, Taylor has already helped raise over $250,000 to ALD research. With all that hype, let's get into the real conversation. Here's my conversation with Taylor Kane. Enjoy. Taylor, what's up? How's it going?
Not much. I'm good. It is 4 p.m. here in England, so the sun's starting to set. How about you? How's your morning?
It's good. It's 11 a.m. here in Brooklyn, New York. It's kind of cloudy, probably similar to what I hear England is like.
Yes, that is very true.
Why are you in the UK?
So I'm in the UK because my partner lives here, but I'm originally from New Jersey. So I spend most of the year at home, but every few months I come and spend some time here. Obviously, that was difficult with travel restrictions and stuff for the pandemic. So we weren't able to see each other for about 4 months. But then luckily, I was able to go in the summer for 2 months and then went home for 2 months. And now I'm back for 2 months. So
yeah, I know I had a flight booked out to London in September and I had to cancel it.
Yeah, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks when you get here, which definitely makes sense. And we also are in a total lockdown right now. So basically just leaving the house to go on walks and go to the grocery store every so often. But yeah, that's just how things are here.
Well, a lockdown is a perfect time to have a conversation, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, I say, let's get started here, I think. How about, you introduce yourself to the people who don't know you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor Kane. I am 22 years old and a 2020 graduate from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned, I'm from New Jersey, so I'm a Jersey girl. But I think what you should know about me and, the reason that I'm speaking on this podcast today is because when I was 3 years old, my dad was pretty out of the blue diagnosed with a rare genetic brain disease called adrenoleukodystrophy, or ALD for short. At the time of his diagnosis, the doctors told my family two main things. One, that there was no effective treatment or cure for ALD and that my dad's days were numbered and that he would likely pass away in the next couple of years. And two, that ALD is what's known as an X-linked disease, which means that it's carried on the X chromosome. And since fathers pass their X chromosomes to their daughters, this meant that I was a genetic carrier of the disease and that I would have a 50% chance of passing the disease on when I had children one day. Over the next 2 years, my dad's condition declined. I don't have a ton of memories from that time, but I've done a lot of digging over the years to learn as much as I possibly could about my dad's final days. And he passed away in 2003 when I was 5 years old, when I was in kindergarten. But I think at first, after I lost my dad, I definitely experienced so much loneliness, feeling so different than the people around me. It wasn't for years later that I even met another person my age who didn't have both parents that were living. But once I got to middle school, I started really wanting to start talking about my story more. I don't know what changed, but I started wanting to write. I wrote an article that was published in a local magazine that talked about my dad's story and his diagnosis. And then once I got to high school, I started thinking more about what my carrier status meant for me. I knew that I was a carrier for as long as I can remember. My mom was always really open about it with me. But it was also around this age where I was learning that being a carrier was a lot more than met the eye. And by that, I mean, I was finding out that carriers of ALD could develop symptoms of the disease and that many of them actually did. Historically, it was thought that for X-linked diseases, that men and boys were affected and that women were just carriers, and basically just carried the disease, that they were like a vessel that could pass the disease on. Today, we know that over 90% of ALD carriers eventually develop symptoms of the disease. Not the same as those, in boys and men, and typically not the brain disorder, but, I know a handful of women who have a lot of walking difficulties, have walkers, wheelchairs. You can also develop bladder and bowel dysfunction, neuropathy, movement disorders. There's a whole range of things. But unfortunately, there's still not a lot of research on the symptoms that we can experience. We do have some doctors that are currently researching it, which is really exciting. But, I started realizing like the major gap that existed between what carriers needed and what they were able to access. As far as symptoms went, as far as information regarding alternative reproductive options or, the potential of having a healthy child without the condition, and also just the mental health and psychosocial support. There's so much fear associated with being a carrier. For a lot of carriers, there's also a lot of guilt because they've found out they were a carrier after already passing down the disease. I feel really lucky to know ahead of time before having children. And I also found out that these issues weren't just in the ALD community, that they existed for basically all X-linked diseases. Some others are Duchenne muscular dystrophy, hemophilia A and B. And so something just clicked in my mind. And in 2017, my freshman year of college, I founded my nonprofit organization, Remember the Girls, which is the first and only organization that is dedicated to supporting and bringing more resources to females with X-linked disorders. So that's a mouthful, but that's a little bit about me.
One, I'm very sorry to hear about your father passing. And that was when you were 5 years old?
Yes, it was.
So at that time, you didn't really, it was probably, you weren't processing the reasons why. But as you grew up, it kind of like sparked this interest in ALD, and which is how I found you, because I found you through Remember the Girls. And I just found that fascinating because it has a very specific focus. I'm in the part of this Facebook group called Retinitis Pigmentosa. And basically people in that Facebook group, they create posts asking for advice and tips or just questions out of curiosity to other people who have RP. Mm-hmm. And I had someone in that group, they had a blog post written with...
Yes.
Yeah, for RP. And then I was like, oh, that's cool. So that's how I found you. So yeah, retinitis pigmentosa, which is what I have, is an X-linked. I guess that's the connection here, I guess.
Yeah, I found the woman who wrote the blog post. I randomly found her on Instagram as well, Tia, and I saw that, I think it was in her bio, that she was diagnosed with X-linked RP. And just from my understanding, since it is an X-linked disease, it's more of, I don't know all the intricacies of RP specifically, but I know it's another condition where females are typically thought of as carriers. So I thought it was really fascinating that she had that diagnosis, and that she did have symptoms that were severe enough to be considered to have a diagnosis. But that kind of flows into another interesting conversation, or a point that is often brought up in Remember the Girls. It's just to do with language itself and the term carrier. I think even just this year, the term carrier has been used on the news every single day talking about COVID, because it's used as being someone is an asymptomatic carrier, and carrier just pretty much implies that people are asymptomatic and that they just carry this and can pass it on. And I think that in the language itself and just the term carrier has caused a lot of the difficulties that we women affected by X-linked conditions have faced. Like, I've over the years have had comments, or I remember one time I was speaking on a panel, and someone tweeted about the panel that I didn't know, but they were saying like, oh, why would you have a carrier speak about this? Like, she's just a carrier. It's not that big of a deal. And I think, most people, obviously in that case, it was just ignorance and her not knowing that, I likely have symptoms of my condition, that I already think that I am developing some mild symptoms, that I have to make really difficult decisions when I have kids. And if I did have children naturally, I could have a son that could potentially pass away. I don't think that people take into account all the issues that we face just because we have this carrier term that's so closely stuck to us, and it kind of just makes us easier to brush under the rug. I don't think there's necessarily a solution. I think some communities embrace the term carrier more than others. In the ALD community, we're moving away from the term carrier completely and just saying a female with ALD. But I don't know if that is exactly right for us either, because it's hard. It's hard like to know what we should be called, but I think that's something that we're working on. And I think having language that can describe us better is really important.
Yeah, I agree. I like that you're thinking through the language of things, and I think that's definitely, whoever wrote that comment was very inconsiderate. There's a psychological weight that comes with knowing that you're a carrier. For example, I have retinitis pigmentosa, and I've had genetic testing done, and my children will have a 50% chance of having, RP, and so that does make me think, like a little bit more about like, okay, do I want to have children, pass this on? I think I do want to have children because, I'm glad I was born, so I have RP, I'm fine, but it is something to consider, and it is something that, potential partner of mine has to factor in too. When you meet someone,
definitely,
you got to share that info with them, because, if they want children, they need to know, what they're signing up for. So, and that can change the dynamic. It can add stress, anxiety to telling your partner, and then, but yeah, what are your experiences with that?
Yeah, luckily I haven't had any bad experiences, but I think part of that is that since I'm so like open and outward about Remember the Girls and also my carrier status, and I write blogs and I do a lot of advocacy on my social media, any like partner I've had, it's pretty easy for them to figure it out on their own. So it comes up in conversation really early, and that's something I'm completely fine with. I'm definitely more on the side of being an open book, but I agree it's hard. And I think something that bothers me even more than me having, the 50% chance of passing the condition on, regardless of my partner's genetics. I think people confuse that. I think people who aren't, in our rare disease world or in the medical world, they think that both parents need to be a carrier of the disease to pass it down. That's only in the case of like autosomal recessive conditions, like cystic fibrosis. Like with an X-linked condition or autosomal dominant or other types, like that's not the case. Like it's just one of the parents. So I think we really need to make sure like people know that, because a lot of people don't. But I think something that bothers me more, at least with my partner now, is thinking long term. Like if I do get these symptoms, and if some of them can be pretty embarrassing, especially as a woman, like having bladder or bowel dysfunction or incontinence and things like that, that's hard for me to think about. Like, will my partner have to deal with that? Am I going to embarrass myself? Will I need someone to take care of me? I mean, honestly, I think since I'm more on the younger side, it really doesn't get to me. Like sometimes I'll think about it for a few minutes, but I don't know. I guess since I'm also so involved in like the advocacy world, it's kind of easy for me to almost brush it off, or feel like it's not actually going to happen to me. It's hard to explain, but I feel like in a way, being so involved has made me become a bit desensitized to it. So I think I'm trying to refine that balance of, connecting with my feelings and about the future, and also, not letting it ruin my everyday, because the future is so uncertain. So I'm trying not to worry about what could possibly happen. But yeah, the relationship part is definitely difficult for anyone that has any anything genetic or any condition, I think relationships and friendships definitely bring a lot of difficult conversations that aren't easy to navigate.
Definitely, definitely. You know, I talk a lot about on this podcast about being open and transparent. And, you know, that's kind of why it's called the See-Through Podcast, is because I'm trying to like create transparency on, you know, various disabilities and what comes along with them. And I think, you know, this is definitely part of that conversation in terms of when do you tell someone, what do you tell them, how do you tell them? And, you know, for example, you're a carrier, but you're also you're likely to experience symptoms of ALD.
Mm-hmm.
So not only do you have to factor in what your partner is going to think about in terms of the children you produce, but they also have to factor in like lifestyle changes later on, you know, because that's something that I have to factor in, you know. And I in the past, before I was more open about RP, it was something that kind of tore me up a bit inside, where I felt almost like I felt like by me meeting someone and getting entangled in their life, that the future, that I was going to ruin their life because they're going to have to like change their plans for me, you know, act accordingly to, you know, me potentially going like completely blind, you know, and what that entails. Like even small things like driving a car, you know, going on a vacation and not being able to like rent a car and drive around, and you know, and even silly things is like connecting my masculinity to things like driving a car, you know, like feeling like like, oh, like I can't even drive a car, like I can't even like quote unquote provide for my partner. So but yeah, that's like there's a psychology behind all that stuff, and I think, like you said, you feel desensitized because you've been talking about it for so long, and I think that's a good thing. I think I think when people hold it in and they don't think about it, I just think you're aware of it, and there's going to be very few surprises for you around the corner, and I think it helps you and the people around you.
That's true. Yeah, I relate to everything you just said 100%. And it's interesting you bring up connecting things to your masculinity, because I think with my carrier status, you know, I connect a lot of things to my femininity. And personally, I'm not the most like, I don't want to say family oriented, but I've never been like really eager to have kids or anything like that. Honestly, growing up and mostly in high school and through most of college, I was pretty set on not having kids. I don't know if that's because of my carrier status. Deep down, I always knew that if I did have kids, I would do in vitro fertilization with pre-implantation genetic testing, or IVF with PGT. But for a while, I was really like, no, I just want to be a career woman. But anyway, I'm kind of over that phase now since I'm getting a little bit older. But I think just tying, you know, that the fact that like I carry this defective gene and could, you know, that I won't be getting pregnant the natural way, you know, I think that does have ties into like my femininity, or as I was talking about with potential symptoms that could be embarrassing or cause issues with intimacy and things like that. I definitely do. I think if I had to say one thing that I feel the most insecure about regarding my condition is like the ties to femininity. And it's weird because I never thought that would really bother me, but the older I get, it does. And I think we've like been dealt this hand. So, and we kind of think like, oh, we shouldn't let this bother us. Like, and you say like, oh yeah, maybe I won't be able to drive a car or, you know, get a car and drive around on a vacation, but these are the cards I've been dealt. But I feel like it's still hard to always like turn that part off in your brain. And when you think about the little things, or when I think about the fact that I'll never be able to experience like getting pregnant naturally, and I'll have to go through, you know, like an expensive, difficult mentally and physically like procedure to have kids. It is weird just thinking that I'll never have that experience that most women do. But I mean, I don't think about it that often, really. This has kind of just triggered that in my mind. I'll think about it from time to time, but since I'm only 22, it still feels so far away. but it is weird, like from a woman's perspective of thinking on the things that I'll miss out on.
Definitely. And then, and that treatment is fairly new too. So, it's good that you have that option, I guess, is the most positive way to look at it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. Like, you talked about, I feel like I'm going to say this wrong because
yeah, it was hard for me to say too.
Femininity. I don't know.
I think that's it.
Everyone, you know what I'm trying to say. But yeah, it's funny that you talk about that because you're a carrier of a X-linked thing, but it's contributing to how you view your feminine side. And Remember the Girls, I think, doesn't just feature stories about yourself. It features a bunch of different amazing people and their stories. Maybe talk a little bit about Remember the Girls and what your goal is there.
Yeah, totally. So as I mentioned, I started Remember the Girls in 2017. It pretty much started out as, me becoming a nonprofit, and then creating like a private Facebook group and making like a master list of excellent conditions, and pretty much just doing like tons of messaging on Facebook, tons of emailing, and trying to like get this X-linked carrier community together. So yeah, over the years, it's definitely been a lot of work and a lot of outreach. Just one, finding the different women in these conditions, but also getting them to accept like, okay, it's time for me to put more care into myself. A lot of carriers are also caregivers, and they take care of a son, or someone else with, that X-linked condition. So I think it's so easy just to not think about yourself. And I also think as women, we're so often told that like any symptoms that we face are caused by anxiety or caused by being like a nervous mother or an overworked woman. So I think it's easy for us to just be like, oh, this pain is just my anxiety, and just brush it off. But over the years, yeah, through a lot of outreach and connecting with so many other organizations and people, Remember the Girls has grown to a group of about 830 carriers from 25 plus different X-linked disease groups. And we do feature different carrier stories on our website, rememberthegirls.org. We have people write about their experiences, which I think is so important because there's not one story of being a carrier. Like, as I mentioned, I found out, from my dad's diagnosis, but in the ALD community, most carriers find out after already passing it down to a son, because the disease is typically early onset in boys. So they'll either pass away or have like a certain disability and won't end up having children. So most carriers do not find out in my position, but since my dad had the later onset version and didn't get, brain symptoms of the disease till he was in his 40s, that's why I'm here. But I think there's no one story. And yeah, I think that my story and my perspective is so not like wholly encompassing of the group as itself, my opinions, my feelings, even just the culture that I grew up in. Because, Remember the Girls is an international organization. And I think when it comes to disease, genetics, the transparency that you talked about, I think it's completely different in America than it is in, even being here in England, people are less likely to have that transparency. This is something I've noticed, like regarding disease. And of course, in a lot of other countries, it's even taboo to talk about it. So I think, it's important to represent so many different stories and perspectives. So we do have a big support group, but we also are working on a bunch of different projects at the moment, which is really exciting. I ran the organization like I was in college for most of the time the organization has existed. So obviously I had to balance doing school. I've also always had jobs ever since I was 15. So I've always had a lot going on. But now that I'm graduated, we can finally start getting these projects out. One of the ones we're working on right now is creating a family planning toolkit. So it basically will be like an all-encompassing hub on our website, with a gear towards X-linked carriers and their partners, so they can learn about all the options that are available to them. We're going to have testimonial videos, genetic counselors speaking about the different options, and also where people can take the next steps. Like if they do want to talk to a medical professional about these options and see what is best for them, or ask their insurance company if they cover these options. We want to provide them with the skills to take those next steps and try to include as much cost information as possible. With alternative reproduction, it's super variable how much it costs based on your insurance. And when you talked about kind of feeling like a burden earlier, another thing that came to mind was thinking about how IVF can be like up to $25,000, and how even before my dad passed away, him and my mom started saving money for me to be able to have access to that one day. And even though I'm so appreciative of that, it almost makes me feel bad thinking like, that they've had to put that money aside for me because I'm a carrier of this disease. I don't know. It just makes you feel bad. But yeah, so that's one of the projects we are working on, and we just want to provide as much information as possible. But we have a lot of other things in the pipeline, like things about self-advocacy at doctor's appointments. And eventually I would love to have like a Remember the Girls conference, or also fund research and things like that. We have a lot of big goals, but yeah, I'm so passionate about it. Like every single day, I wouldn't want to be doing anything different. And I think we have made a lot of progress in kind of breaking the stigma of what it means to be a carrier over the last couple of years, but we definitely still have a long way to go. But even, any exposure and talking about it, like on this podcast, it's just helping break down that barrier of people's understanding of what a carrier of an X-linked condition actually is.
Definitely. And going back a little bit, you mentioned, you said IFB?
IVF. So that's the in vitro fertilization.
Oh,
with
okay.
Genetic.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a mouthful as well.
So you're saying your parents have put money aside for that?
Yeah, I don't know how much really. I don't know the details. It really all depends where I end up living. Like if I'm in America, obviously that'll be massively different than if I'm like in England, for example, because of the health systems. But yeah, they did start putting money aside, and I'm so grateful for that, just because, as I mentioned, it can be really expensive.
How much does it typically cost?
So it can cost anywhere from $5,000 to $25,000 for one cycle, and a cycle isn't guaranteed to work. And so obviously if you also want to have additional kids, you go through another cycle. So it can be super expensive.
Hopefully, the technology improves and then the success rate improves. And
right. Yeah.
Yeah. So back to Remember the Girls, what I really like about it is the community aspect of how you're not just talking about ALD, like we said, but you're talking about a bunch of X-linked diseases and disorders. So it's like, that's kind of how I am on this podcast. I have a vision disability, but I like to talk to everyone because I think that the disability community as a whole needs to be less cliquey, I think. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, even if we have different conditions or different struggles, like we still are battling so many of the same problems. And it only makes sense like to join forces, I think, and, fight for, if it's disability legislation or, and Remember the Girls case, like demand greater access. I think it only makes sense to join forces. And one of the reasons why I made Remember the Girls for all X-linked carriers and not ALD specific is I saw how the rare disease community and organizations like Global Genes and NORD and the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases brought together the entire community and were able to there's over 7,000 different rare diseases. And they were able to bring so many advocates from so many disease groups together and just all be like fighting for the same cause. And I think that just, showed me that I need to Remember the Girls to do the same. On the other side of the coin, I think, and something else that I want to get into, and such a big part of Remember the Girls, is just the female empowerment aspect. And, seeing that a lot of the issues that we face as carriers are directly related to us being women. One of them is, as I mentioned earlier, our symptoms being brushed off, or being considered, like anxiety prone or being neurotic mothers and all those tropes and stereotypes that women so often face. I knew that wasn't just for ALD carriers. Like, I knew that these stereotypes were affecting women in all these different X-linked disease groups. And that was a big reason why for so long our symptoms were not cared about, were not researched, or brushed under the rug. Why for so long, and still today, people on the regular will say to me that I'm so lucky that I'm just a carrier. There's so much stigma still there that existing. And I think a lot of that is because our group is female and of women, and there's a lot of just gender bias in the medical system and in the world as a whole. But I think, those are the main 2 points why I knew I wanted to remember the girls to be multiple diseases, because we really are fighting for the same thing at the end of the day. Like, our diseases might be really different, and our symptoms that we could get could be very different. There is some overlap for certain diseases, of course, if it affects like a different system of the body, but we're still all fighting the same demon. And so I think that's where a lot of the power in Remember the Girls in this podcast is that, it's not focusing on one small subset within like the disease or disability community. It's focusing on something much greater, and that, that we can all come together and use our voices as, a collective.
Yep, I agree completely, and I love how you put that, and I want to talk a little bit about that in terms of you talked about the gender bias in medicine, and you mentioned that earlier, that the Remember the Girls promotes like patient advocacy. I know on your website you talk about there's like a gender bias in terms of clinical trials, and how predominantly it's just men in those clinical trials. Can you talk to me about like maybe the advice you give people through Remember the Girls on how to get the most out of your doctor's appointments and how to become more involved in clinical trials as a woman?
For sure. Yeah. So as a whole, like non-disease specific, just as a whole in the history of clinical trials, women have historically been more excluded. It wasn't until for like a 2-decade period, they actually excluded all women of childbearing age. So if it was, which they've reversed that. So I would not, at the time, if that was still going on, I would not be allowed to be involved in any clinical trial, whether I had a condition, whether I was one of the healthy participants. Like, I would be completely excluded because they thought that women's hormones in their body just overcomplicated the results. And they didn't want to risk having women participants that could potentially get pregnant during the trial. So they just decided to exclude women altogether. That has been overturned, but there are still a lot of inadequacies with including women as a whole or doing sex-specific data analysis within studies. We know now that, the male and female body, or, people's bodies are different, and based on the hormones and different things you have in your body, you react differently to treatments. A disease affects you differently. And it's important for trials to acknowledge that. Unfortunately, yes, for a lot of women in X-linked conditions, they don't even have access to being in a trial because trials are not made for those women. Like, they don't accept women. There are some exceptions in some X-linked disease communities. I know for like Alport syndrome, I've seen a trial recently that was recruiting women Alport syndrome patients. They also do not use the term carrier because a lot of their carriers, quote unquote, do have symptoms and need access to treatments. But as far as advice, while I can't give advice to try to get into clinical trials specifically, I would say my advice, and also advice that's come out of Remember the Girls groups and support and discussions, is just advocating for yourself, also making appointments different from your sons if you have a son that has the condition. I know a lot of women will be at their son's condition with a specialist and mention like, oh, I have some symptoms too. Doctors that I know, they say that women need to make their own appointments, like separate from their sons, and be able to talk about their symptoms with that specialist one-on-one. I think also a great tool is bringing recent research studies, especially if you're, or just being really knowledgeable about like the latest research in your disease group for women. Like, I know when I go into doctor's appointments, like a general appointment, and I mentioned that I'm a carrier of ALD, I'll say like, oh, carriers, a lot of them have symptoms. Like, I'll say things that I know to be true, because I know for a more general doctor, they probably haven't even heard of ALD. And if they haven't heard of it, then they definitely haven't heard of how it affects women. So I kind of just keep like this arsenal of facts in my back pocket. You can also like write things on your phone. You can have research articles on your phone, or print them out or send them to doctors. I think there's a lot that we can do, not only for our own healthcare and benefit, but also for the doctor's knowledge. I think in the rare disease community, it's so often that we're like telling doctors, teaching doctors about our own diseases. And that's not because these doctors are bad or that they aren't intelligent. Like there's over 7,000 rare diseases. It's impossible for any doctor to know all of them, or to know even like 5% of them, honestly. There's so many of them. So it is really often that we become like the educator. But I think I would tell women to embrace that role and don't allow yourself to be talked down to. Don't allow a doctor who suggests that your symptoms could be in your head. If someone says that to you, just go to another doctor. Like, do not take that, because women have been facing that for literally the existence of modern medicine. Women have always had to face doctors saying that their symptoms are in their heads. So just don't take that. Don't believe it. You know your body better than anyone else. So just keep looking for answers, looking for a doctor or a specialist who treats you right. And yeah, that's the advice that I would give. There's definitely more for women who have more experience, like directly interacting with specialists. But that's one of the reasons we are creating like a self-advocacy guide that'll help women in our group have these like specific steps written down in front of them about like what they can do, what they should bring, what questions they should ask, et cetera, to their next doctor or specialist appointment.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I understand, even as a male, going to the doctor, I feel like they're so fast and quick with their time that you have to be a little bit prepared and almost have like a pre-written script of your symptoms, mm-hmm. or else they're just going to be like, all right, well, seems like you have, they diagnose you with something that you could have just Googled.
Right. And it's so complicated because it's like you feel like you have to express yourself the perfect way. Like if you don't seem that urgent, or if you're not like being like, oh, I'm in so much pain, then, you can mm-hmm. worry that they might not think that you're actually suffering. But then on the other hand, if you are really urgent, and if you are trying to spit out like, oh, I have this, like, sometimes they'll be like, oh, this patient is, they're searching for a diagnosis, or like they're being too pushy, mm-hmm. It's hard to find that middle balance.
Yep.
But I think a lot of people, patient advocates and also providers, are working to improve that like relationship, that one-on-one relationship. So a question for you, actually, this reminds me, but how do you feel that the relationship between like patients and providers have changed by more telehealth being used?
That's a good question. I think it depends on why you're calling in. And, mm-hmm. like if you have strep throat, then I think telehealth is great, because you can just call in and say, yeah, I have these symptoms. Here's a picture of my throat. It hurts. And then you don't have to like take time to go into an office to get your antibiotics, mm-hmm. that kind of thing. But, telehealth, can only go so far if you're discussing more like deep symptoms within your body, and that, stuff that you don't quite have the language to describe what you're experiencing, and that's the thing that I think it's important what you're doing with kind of promoting like advocacy checklists when you go in, because I think most doctors don't do enough investigative work. You either have to like put it out, you have to like spell it out for them to listen.
Right.
And I think telehealth, maybe you get to that, maybe the anxiety is a little bit less because you're not like face to face with the doctor. You can't pick up the energy of the office and how busy it is. Mm-hmm. And maybe you're more willing to open up a little more on the phone. Maybe you're able to like take pictures of things or write down things and be able to really talk more in depth about what your symptoms are. versus in person, you don't want to like pull out your phone and then read out, a list, but so I don't know. I think it's good and bad. I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are pros and cons, but I just hope like our system doesn't become too reliant on it. Obviously, it's good in a lot of cases, but I agree. Like it can only go so far, like you said. Something else that I just thought of is, I've heard stories from so many carriers where even if they are prepared, they still like get shut down. Like they'll go into a doctor's appointment and say like, oh, I have ALD. And then the doctor will flat out say like, women cannot have ALD. That is not possible. Like it's an X-linked disease. Women don't have it. Or they think, I guess the less intense version, like, oh, it's really rare for women to get symptoms or they're really mild. Most literature online still says that women's symptoms are mild. I don't think being in a wheelchair, which I know more than a handful of carriers who are in wheelchairs in their 50s, I don't think that that's mild personally, not being able to walk. I don't think that's mild at all. Like that's another thing that comes back to language. That just needs to change. That is so misleading. It really is. Like, and a lot of it is just outdated and there's so much, medical literature and there's so many doctors that were educated years and years ago. And, to update them on this niche topic within this niche community of diseases, specifically issues that women face, like it's a hard battle to try to get them that information, but that's something that we're trying. So.
Yeah. And are you talking about specialist or are you talking about kind of more just primary care doctors?
Both. I think when you go to like a specialist that is like known to be a specialist for your own disease, I think that's different because obviously, they should know the latest. But on the other hand, like all across the board, really specialists for like just something more general. Like if you're going to neurologist, endocrinologist, example, I think probably it would more likely happen in a GP. I know I had a really good experience with an endocrinologist where I went to get tested for adrenal insufficiency, just because carriers can experience it. It's pretty uncommon, like actually really uncommon for carriers to have adrenal insufficiency, but it can happen. So I just got tested just in case. And ahead of my appointment, the endocrinologist like researched the condition and she was really knowledgeable on it. And she even said that I taught her a lot. So that was a really good experience. But obviously, many carriers don't have that experience most or a large part of the time that they have appointments. So I think that goes back to being prepared, but also being ready to know what to do next if you do kind of get shut down, and how to pick yourself up and not just succumb to being like, okay, this doctor said being silly and that these aren't actually symptoms and that I'm just imagining it or that it's something else. I think just being cognizant of like, not every appointment is going to be good or going to go the way that you want it to. And just keeping that in mind. Yeah.
Going back to, you asked me about telehealth, and I'd say an advantage of that is there's a lot of reviews now online of doctors.
Right.
And I do that. I research now. I look up reviews of doctors to see, sometimes the reviews will be like, Dr. So-and-so was very rude and only spent 3 minutes with me and would not recommend them. And if they have like too many of those reviews, I'm like, all right, well, I'm not going to that doctor. Yeah. So I would advise people to research their doctors before going into an appointment.
I was just going to say that's why Facebook support groups are so important too, because always in Remember the Girls, people are asking for doctor and specialist recommendations based on where they live. Like just getting feedback from people that have been in a similar situation to you and in your own disease community and knowing what doctors they've had good experiences and bad experiences with, that's really useful information. And why support groups, one of the many reasons why support groups are super helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And going back a little bit too, I think don't like maybe people shouldn't listen to this advice, but don't expect too much from your just primary care doctor. Yeah. Don't expect to get a big diagnosis from them. Like my advice would be to go into them and they're your ticket to a specialist.
Right. Yeah. definitely.
And that should be your goal when you go to them, is to get a referral to a specialist. And then from there, you can do research on who you want to go to. That's a specialist. And there they'll be able to like really focus on you and what you're going through.
Agreed.
You know, as someone with RP, you know, there's not a cure. So, but it is good to monitor your vision and make sure it's not progressing too drastically from, you know, short time span. You know, I also, through going to see a specialist, that they've been able to link me up with, you know, a genetic counselor, where I've been able to get genetic testing done to actually find out, you know, what type of RP I have and kind of the genetic code behind it. So that way I can kind of be aware of the research and that's being done to help maybe reverse or cure my specific strain of RP. So it's all helpful things, and all of that was through a specialist. So if you're having bad times through your primary care, then I would just recommend finding a specialist. And
yeah, definitely. Like, you'll really only get the answers that you're looking for. Because like I said, obviously we know with having rare conditions, yeah, most GPs probably never really heard of them. Just because that's not the nature of what they were taught. Like, they can't know all the diseases. So getting referred to a specialist, and specialists, you know, that are knowledgeable about your condition is so important. And also being prepared, like we spoke about. And I think you brought up a great point about making sure to like check up on yourself. Like you said, check up on, you know, take time to notice if things are progressing. I think that's really important, but also not, at least for carriers, I think, and even in my case, I think it can sometimes be stressful because every little thing, some days I'm like, oh, could this be related to ALD? And then other days I'm like, oh, I'm probably just sore from working out. This is nothing. I think it goes back and forth between, you know, me thinking, I think there's more questions than answers for a lot of us in the rare disease community, I guess is what I'm saying. But just keeping cognizant, I'm remaining cognizant about your own body and what's normal for you and what isn't. I think, like you said, that is great advice for sure.
yeah, and going back, you know, like I said, I'm part of that retinitis pigmentosa Facebook group, and through that kind of community, and I'm sure people get the same thing out of Remember the Girls, is I learn about other people's symptoms. And sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, I experienced that too. And I've always wondered if that was part of my vision.
Right.
You know, so it's, and then the more and more I know about what symptoms I should be experiencing, when I do experience them, I don't freak out as much about them. I'm like, oh, it's just my RP. You know, I don't have WebMD that made me feel like he gave me a lot of anxiety. So yeah.
No, that's so true. Actually, like, this reminds me of at the last ALD conference. I didn't even know this, but I heard it briefly mentioned that a lot of women have really cold hands and feet, which I always have literally icicles for hands and feet, regardless of the weather. And yeah, I thought, like, is this like caused by, like, do I have some problem? But now I'm kind of like, oh, it's probably just related to ALD. And that's comforting in a way, like you said, because it causes me not to think I have some other like blood circulation problem or something like that. So yeah, it is kind of comforting in a way. I completely agree.
Yeah, it's weird that it's comforting, but it's like the more and more I learn about RP, the better I feel about it. You know, and
yeah.
But at first, and I'll definitely admit this, for a longest time, I didn't want to do any research on RP because that was me basically accepting RP and having to face it head on, you know. So, but once you get past that initial like awkwardness of like acceptance and initial research, and once you get more deeper in the weeds on, you know, your disability, I think that your anxiety levels will decrease tremendously. So I recommend everyone, you know, just get up to speed and try to learn as much as you can about your disability.
Yeah, I think that outlook is amazing. I also think it's so important to talk about it because people outside of our community, they like assume the opposite. Like, I know there's a big debate, you know, about when carriers should be tested or told. And there's a lot of older officials or people that aren't in our community that say like, oh, that information will be so detrimental on their life. They can't know until they're older. It'll ruin their childhood. It'll ruin this. It'll ruin that. I'm of the opinion, like you, that the more information I have, the more control I feel, the more empowered I feel about being a carrier of ALD, the better it makes me feel about the future. But I think people assume, because with rare diseases, obviously they can be scary at times. And I think people outside our community assume like, oh, like it's better for them not to know. But like this is our lives and our bodies. Like, why wouldn't you want to know? And obviously at first, like you said, I think most people don't just jump right into it. And that's completely fine because you're processing it. You're taking the time to process it. But you're like a great example of, someone who has came out completely on the other side and not only is really involved in your own RP journey, but has this podcast and is an advocate for people of all various disabilities and illnesses and trying to bring light and attention to the issues we face. Like, I think it's really inspiring. So,
well, thank you. Yeah. And that's, I admit that this podcast is kind of selfish for me because in a way, by learning about other disabilities, and talking to other people, I also bring people on with RP on my podcast too. So I get to like network and, feel not, it basically all in all, it's selfish because it helps me not feel so alone on like an island and gives me a more of a positive perspective. And I think, you need all the help you can get, when it comes to staying positive.
Totally.
So let's talk a little bit more about, ALD when it comes to you specifically. You mentioned your dad had ALD, and after his passing, that's when you were tested and that's when you were diagnosed?
So since ALD is an X-linked condition, I found out I was a carrier right when my dad was diagnosed because I'm an obligate carrier, like 100% carrier. So I knew my family knew right from that moment, just since dads will pass their X chromosome to all their daughters. So I am 100% like inherited my dad's X chromosome. And so I have the ALD gene. So yeah, my family knew from that moment. And I also have a half sister who is also a carrier. And a few cousins who are carriers as well. My dad was like the first diagnosis in the family, but like with a lot of rare diseases, once you get one diagnosis, you get a bunch of others too, family members. So
yeah, my sister has retinitis pigmentosa or RP. What I have as well, because my mom is the one who is the carrier of it. So the same thing as I have a 50% chance. My mom's children had a 50% chance. So 2 out of her 3 children have RP. And my older brother, he didn't inherit it. So, he doesn't have the gene to carry it forward to his children, which is good. But, my sister and myself will have to, monitor if we have children, we'll have to, closely monitor that because 50% chance, that's very high.
Yeah, the odds can be really unfair. My grandmother, who was the carrier who passed it to my dad, she passed it down to all 4 of her kids. And it also had that 50% chance. So yeah, the odds are not good, but like you said, just being cognizant and just knowing, I think information is key, and just knowing that like inheritance chance, and knowing if you do want to pursue an alternative option. Obviously that really depends like on the disease and the severity of it, I think. But if you do want to pursue an alternative option, like I will someday, just knowing what of those options do exist, I think is just the most important thing. Like information really is key.
Yeah, it just goes back to knowing, knowing more about your disability is helpful, and also knowing like alternative treatments. Just the more that's available to you, the more the less weight off of you, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Doesn't take all the weight off, but it helps. And I was looking up a little bit on ALD, and it's considered very rare. I noticed, like you said, it's mainly in males, and it's 1 in 21,000 males have ALD. So it's kind of like RP is considered rare, and I think like 100,000 people in the United States have it. Seems like ALD is a little more rare. And I think there's something about having a rare condition that is like, in terms of, thinking about yourself and in terms of just the odds of getting ALD or getting RP. What is your opinion on that in terms of just kind of coming to terms with, you have a rare condition and that you have something that most people don't have to deal with?
Yeah, I think growing up, I always knew that ALD was a rare disease, but I never really took time to think about what being a rare disease meant. Like I knew a lot of people, I knew it meant, I knew it meant that a lot of people didn't have it, but I didn't know that there was all these other rare diseases that like fell into this category. I was so in the ALD bubble. And, I remember being young and being in like fourth grade and being so proud that I could spell adrenoleukodystrophy because it's such a long word that, as we talked about before we started, is difficult to pronounce. And it's really difficult to explain. Like, even now, I think most of my close friends, they know what ALD is, but it's, if you haven't lived the experience, you don't really know what it is. I've actually taken the time to try to figure out, like through looking through ancestry and death records and stuff, how far they're back, because obviously with genetic diseases, they go back and back in your family tree. They start somewhere with a mutation, which is really weird to think and goes way over my head, like why or how that happens. But I have tried to track back in my dad's side of the family, like where ALD came from. But it's been hard because this is really random, but like a few of my grandmother's brothers who could have potentially had ALD since she was a carrier. So she either got it from her mother, and in that case, some of her brothers could have had it, or she got it from her father, who would have passed it down to her. But a bunch of her brothers died in like the 1918 flu when they were living in Pennsylvania. So when they were really young, so before like they would have experienced the disease. So it's been really hard to try to figure out where the disease came from in my dad's side of the family. But I am curious to know. I hope one day I can keep going further back and figure it out. But I agree. I mean, I think I say the word rare disease so often that to me it feels like such a big thing. But if most people on the planet heard rare disease, they'd be like, what's that? So it is kind of weird existing in this space of having something that's so meaningful to you that most people don't even know what it is, but just life.
Yeah, it's just life. Life isn't fair. People are, handed different cards. And I think all we can do is try to handle our specific situation the best way possible.
Mm-hmm.
Do you talk, this is a little bit off from what we're talking about, but what do you discuss topics like this in the memoir you have published, which is
Yes.
Rare Like Us? Let's hear about that.
Yes. I published a memoir about my dad and family story with ALD last August. I was writing it for about 3.5 years, all through college. And through that process, I learned so much about my dad's illness and while he was sick, just through interviewing people in my family, through looking through medical records and things like that. But I do talk a lot about a lot of these topics. Honestly, I talk about my carrier status. I talk about just what I just said about what it's like just being in a rare disease family and feeling like you're different than other people, feeling isolated, feeling like you have a future that's so uncertain. Yeah, I talk about a lot of these topics, but definitely ends on a very positive note of, I feel empowered to have the knowledge that I do. And I feel like, I mean, I'm not very religious or anything like that, but I do feel like that there's a reason that my life is this way. And I think my dad would be so glad to know that even though he had passed away from this disease, that so much effort from my family and from myself has gone to help other people who are impacted by ALD and who are carriers of X-linked conditions. So I really do feel like there's a purpose, like a greater purpose behind everything that I do. And I think that comes across a lot in the book. But yeah, it keeps interesting. You definitely don't have to be someone who knows a lot about diseases or anything. Like, I don't use intense medical terms, and I include a lot of just like stories and synopsis, and I try to include some humor in there as well. So I think, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I think it's an exciting book to read. And yeah, there's a lot in there that I think you would enjoy. So it's available on Amazon if anyone's interested. It's called Rare Like Us by Taylor Kane. And I would love, if you do read it, to let me know what you think.
Yeah, everyone go to Amazon and buy the book. Read it. It's available digitally and paperback?
It is, yes. And I'm also working on recording like an audiobook on YouTube.
Nice.
Just for people who are like visually impaired or can't read like a hard copy or an e-copy. Because I think, especially a book that is focused on a rare disease, like it needs to be accessible as possible. So I'm just doing it the old-fashioned way, just recording myself on a microphone and just uploading it to YouTube pretty much. But I think it'll be useful.
That's great. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people will appreciate that. So you have done quite a lot. You talked about, you making your dad proud about all the effort that you've put into this. You do a lot of public speaking. You're obviously an advocate, and you've been successful in terms of, even creating, changes to government structures. Like in New Jersey, you enacted a law basically requiring the screening of newborns for ALD in New Jersey to kind of help, diagnose before the onset of symptoms, because it's easier to kind of treat it if you treat it earlier. So I'm sure that was a huge win. What's next for you?
I get asked this question a lot, and the truth is I don't really know. I know where my passions lie. I know what I care about. I know that I'm always going to continue doing Remember the Girls and being involved in the rare disease community. I love writing. I love public speaking. And I do believe that I have a voice and a message that should be heard. So I'm going to continue down that path. But yeah, I guess I don't really see my life as like a list of accomplishments. I more see it as things that I still have yet to do. I feel like there's so many things I still want to do career-wise, advocacy-wise, and also obviously life-wise, just since I'm only 22. But I'm excited for the future ahead of me, even despite the fact that I'll likely have symptoms of ALD. And yeah, I think there's a lot to look forward to. And I love things like this because I love meeting other people just who can understand a lot of the intricacies, of having a rare condition that, our friends and people who aren't impacted by a rare disease just simply can't understand. Even if they try, it's something that you really can never understand what it's like to be in our shoes unless you're in them. So I always appreciate conversations like this, and I appreciate you inviting me to be a guest. And it was a really good conversation. So thank you.
Definitely. Yeah, everyone have Taylor Kane on your radar. She's doing a lot. She's already done a lot. You can visit Remember the Girls. You can find them online. It's the rememberthegirls.org, right?
Yes. And then you can find all of our social media. And if you want to get in touch with me directly, you can also email me through the website. So everything's just on there. And then my personal website is just taylorkane.com. So you can check that out too.
Do you want to promote any of your like social media handles or anything like that?
Yeah. So if you want to follow me on my social media accounts, my Twitter and Instagram are at Rare Like Her. So similar to my book, but it's at Rare Like Her. And I post a lot of content relating to my organization, my advocacy, rare disease stuff in general. So definitely give me a follow in there if you're interested in keeping up with what I'm doing. And yeah, I'll give you a follow back.
Awesome. Yeah, give her a follow. To make things easy for everyone, if you want to access any of those links, just click the show description and you can find links there. But Taylor, I have one more question for you. It's typically how I end this podcast is I let my guests give a shout out to a nonprofit or kind of charity or some organization that they think should be on more people's radars. Anything in mind?
Well, I guess I'm also a little biased about this, but Remember the Girls. It's still a newer organization and we still have a lot of growing to do, but we're always looking for support, whether that be on social media, through financial donations. Giving Tuesday is right around the corner. at the time we're recording this at least. But other than that, I would probably say just there's so many amazing organizations that are dedicated to different rare conditions. You can find lists of them like on the National Organization for Rare Disorders website. I would just do some research, check out what organizations exist in the rare disease space and see if there's any you're interested in supporting, because there's a lot of great ones. And so many people I know work completely volunteer, like myself, to run the organization that they do. So I think they deserve a lot of support.
Awesome. Yeah. And again, I'll add that link into the show description. And I think there's no shame in promoting your own organization. So yeah, everyone go check out Remember the Girls. But I've taken up, I think, most of your day now. It's a pretty long interview. But I've enjoyed every second, and I think you provided a lot of valuable insights, and we probably could have talked for another 4, but let's just call it here. And I'm glad we connected. I'm glad that, we are friends now, and so it's good. I look forward to keeping in touch, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Lance. Thanks for having me as a guest. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. All right. Take care, Taylor.
Thanks.
Well, that does it for episode 16 featuring Taylor Kane. I hope everyone got something out of that conversation. I know I definitely did. And as I said earlier, if you're interested in learning more about the organizations Taylor is affiliated with, just click the show description, and there you'll find all the links you need to access. And if you want to learn more about the See-Through podcast, you can find the podcast online at seethroughpod.com. We are also on all social media channels. You can find us using the handle at seethroughpod, SEETHROUGHPOD. And quick update, the See-Through podcast is now on TikTok. So if you're on TikTok, I'd love it if you could give us a follow. And a new episode will be out next Sunday, so keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, you know the drill. Stay transparent, and I'll chat with you guys next week. Take care.